Elliot, who I think is still alive, I had an email, I've never met him, I had some email correspondence with him a couple of months ago, wrote this great book in 1973 called Brain Control, in which, now the 60s and early 70s were a very turbulent time, as those of us who lived through them and retained brain cells will remember, and people were seriously talking about biomedical interventions to cure violence, to cure crime, to cure riots, to cure war. And nothing came of it. The science wasn't there. It's possible that this is just that era again. And I hope not. I mean, I hope I am not part of a sparking of hype and concern about something that's not realistic. But I think of this more, not as so much pendulum swings of history, but spirals or helices of history. We're in the same place, X, Y axis, but we're different on the Z axis. We know more about the brain. We know kinds of deep brain stimulation that work. We've got MRIs and other techniques to actually localize things in the brain that they didn't have when they were relying on X-rays and looking at ventricles. We're in a different place, and I think the potential consequences are much more serious today. It doesn't mean they will happen, but I think it's appropriate for us to start to think about them and start to worry about them. And as far as I can tell, almost no one is doing that. So my final word to those of you in the Penn Law student group, and to those of you not, is think about these issues. Learn more about them. Worry about them. Worry about them in a scientifically rigorous way. I'm not in favor of knee-jerk reactions saying it's scary, let's ban it all. Everything is complicated. And the right answer from a lawyer to any question should always start with the two words, it depends, because it always does. But take them seriously, because only if we have people in our society who've begun to educate themselves or get educated about these issues and think about them and worry about them, do we have any chance of using these new technologies, which will undoubtedly have beneficial uses and harmful uses. A jet airplane brought me here. Until a decade ago, I never would have thought that a jet airplane could bring down a skyscraper. All technologies can be used for good or for ill. These technologies will have good uses and bad uses. It should be our job to do what we can to maximize the benefits of these technologies and minimize their harms. And I hope you will join me, Stephen, Amy, Martha, everyone else concerned in this field to try to make that happen. Thank you. Now for my neuro enhancer.
This brain would like to thank that brain.
Oh, is this a concession? No doubt it's not.
For tickling the larynx of that body and producing perturbations in your brain. Thank you very much, Hank.
We hope synapses have fired.
We hope synapses have fired. Hank has kindly consented to answer questions. I'll let him moderate for the next 25 or so minutes. And then when we're done, we hope you will all join us outside for a reception with drinks and food. So just please raise your hands, and Hank will call on people as well.
One qualification, I've consented to try to answer questions. We'll see. Questions? Yeah.
So in your treatment of these different brain interventions,
Yeah.
you've kind of medicalized them in the sense of putting out FDA-type procedures
Yep.
for safety and efficacy.
Which don't exist in the rest of society.
So this is what I was going to ask you. Does it matter that prison sentences may not have ever been proved safe or effective when you're trying to hold these new procedures up to that type of a standard?
So I think it should. You know, if we were just inventing prisons, actually the penitentiary was invented here, wasn't it? By the Quakers here in Philadelphia. In retrospect, I'd like to say, well, I'll do a randomized clinical double-blind controlled trial where some people think they're in, you know, people don't really know whether they're in prison or not. But there, of course, they had to do something with people. So at some point, you've got to act to do something. But more fundamentally, yeah, I would have liked to see proof of safety and efficacy before things like that, or now that we've used them, and now that we've got abundant proof that prisons aren't particularly safe or effective at anything other than training people to be better criminals, maybe fairly effective at keeping people from victimizing folks outside the prison for a while. Yeah, I think that I would have liked to see that, but it didn't happen, and it's now existing. It's hard to turn back time's arrow. You know, we can't go back. We've got prisons. I think it would have been great if we had tested them for safety and efficacy, but we didn't. The fact that we didn't do that in the past does not imply that we shouldn't do that in the future. The fact that we used to do things in a half-baked way doesn't mean that now that we know better, we should continue to do things in a half-baked way. I do think, so maybe hidden in your question, or maybe the intent of your question would have been a little different. Given that we know that prisons are so terrible, should we hold other non-prison interventions to a high standard? And that's an interesting question, but I think that goes to just how safe and effective the other interventions have to be, not to whether or not we should test them for safety and efficacy. And if we, I might be willing to consider an emergency exception, but in general, no, I think we should look at all these rigorously for safety and efficacy.
Well, that was more my intent, which is that in a clinical trial of a new therapy, first you compare against placebo, but then in later stages of evaluation, you compare to the standard.
So ultimately, you should, yes.
And it may be easier, actually, to prove efficacy over the standard, since there's a lot of evidence that prisons actually exacerbate certain types of situations.
So to that extent, I agree with you fully. When you're making the safety and efficacy, whoever ends up making the safety and efficacy determination should do it compared to the realistic alternative, which in our society for many of these would be long terms in prison. And that provides a not very impressive standard to meet. Doesn't mean necessarily you can beat it, but yeah, you shouldn't look at it compared to some ideal, completely healthy alternative. Yes?
Yes, tell me, in your judgment, can a person who is not determined seriously take or consider an issue of the gravity that you are talking about seriously? Meaning, you advised us to take this seriously, but who among us is determined seriously enough to know what seriously means?
Okay. Yeah, I think the question is really one of who's capable, who's qualified, who's committed and dedicated enough, and enough of an appropriate philosopher king to make these decisions, about what's appropriate and what's not. And for that, I hope that's kind of captured. The philosopher king was a little bit of a flourish, but I hope that's captured the idea of your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to preface with that thought my question, which is the economics of this matter. When in fact, when you alter the behavior of others, a group of others who are incarcerated, at the expense of the public, and if at that expense we can model, do you think the drug companies would be in favor of that proposition?
If it's a profitable drug for them, I suspect they would be. But I also think that legislatures and others making the decisions should think about what are the long-term costs and benefits for the public as a whole. If you're spending $10 million up front and it saves you $100 million in terms of crime, that makes sense. But that gets back to your question, who's the appropriate judge? And for that I have a simple, though not deeply satisfying answer. And I'm with Winston Churchill. Democracy is the word